Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Business of Property. I'm your host, Cheryl Leong from Property Development Australia. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we virtually meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. And also to anyone that's celebrating Chinese New Year, Happy Lunar New Year or Gong Hei Fat Choi to everyone, wishing everyone that's listening into the business of property an abundant, a prosperous, a joyful year filled with happiness and love and lots of projects as well. So let's dive into it. Hello, everyone in Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube land. Give me a shout out if you're here with us today in the comments below. Hi. And kicking off our Build Your Team series on the business of property, I'll be speaking to an urban planner, 𝐿𝐴 from Urban Planning, who is an experienced urban planner with over 14 years working in various councils and consultancies, predominantly in New South Wales. His specialisation is in residential projects in the Sydney Metro. So Ellie is going to be sharing with us some of the basics around, who is an urban planner, when to use an urban planner, and also talking us through some of the basics around the Land and Environmental Court as well. So without further ado, Ellie, please come down to join us.
Hey Cheryl, thanks for inviting me tonight.
Great to have you here. Thank you very much for being here today. So Ellie, tell us a little bit about your background in planning, how long you've been in planning and when you started your own practice.
Yeah, sure. Good question. So I've been practicing as a town planner for probably the last 14 years or so. I've had a wide range of experience in different councils, in Waverley Council as well as Hurstville Council, which is now known as Georges River. Worked at Urbis, probably the largest planning firm in the country. And the last 7 years or so, I've been running my own practice based in Sydney.
Fantastic. So we're part of the Build Your Team series. We want to give people an understanding of who they need in their team if you're putting together development projects. So let's start off with the basics. What is an urban planner? And then we can talk about the role of the urban planner.
Okay.
Who is an urban planner?
Good question. For those that might remember the game SimCity, where you used to be able to build towns and communities, on your computer.
Is that Minecraft now? Is that the new thing?
I think now it's probably Minecraft, where you get to build things. But back then, I don't know if the computer program is still around, but basically you'd be able to build cities and roads and schools and things like that. Well, is town planning, but most town planners don't really have the opportunity, let's say, to build new towns and cities and suburbs, especially here in Sydney, where as you know, things are pretty jam-packed in Sydney. So what the most popular, I guess, most common role a town planner or an urban planner gets involved with is really if, for example, mum and dad want to renovate their home. It needs to go through the council approval process, known in New South Wales as a development application or a DA. Or on the other side, if it's a developer wanting to get a block of apartments approved, or a childcare centre, or potentially sometimes you need a town planner if you're opening up a new business, like a shop or a restaurant. So that's really the bread and butter of what a town planner does, and that's really the main focus is DAs and dealing with councils on a daily basis. And another aspect of what an urban planner does is give development advice on properties. So it might be a property where someone's looking to purchase it on the market or off the market, or it's a property where someone owns and they want to know what they can do with the property. So an urban planner naturally can navigate through the minefield of all the planning red tape, the LEPs and the DCPs, the various planning controls, and interpret how those controls can apply to that piece of land, as well as how you can the client or developer or mum and dad can maximize what they can do on their piece of land.
Yeah. So would you say, much like, say, doing your own accounts, that you could probably do your own accounts and lodge your own planning application yourself, but if you don't know the ins and the outs, it's likely you're going to miss something or probably get it wrong. Yeah,
and unfortunately, those types of clients come to me after the fact. So they might come to me with a refusal to say, Ellie, I've got a refusal, what do I do? So I go in there and, kind of clean everything up and relodge the application with a new package. So that's fairly common. But in saying that, not every project requires a town planner, especially a small project. I would love it if I didn't have to get involved in smaller projects. But these days, the planning controls are very complicated, and the council are also very difficult to deal with. So naturally, it's difficult for a mum and dad to deal with council. So the next person in line would be the architect or the building designer. But also, they're not fully up to speed with how councils operate and the planning control. So that's why more often than not, you do have to engage an urban planner to help you steer the process through council.
Yeah, and I guess that's the reason why we've got this sort of two-pronged approach with planning, that you can choose to go through a development application or get your project certified. Can you just on a high level tell us what the difference is between a DA and a compliant development?
Sure. So there are actually three pathways of getting an approval, a project approved. The third one, it's probably the least known. It's called exempt development. I know you didn't ask me that question, but a lot of it is like cosmetic work and internal changes. So you can do some cosmetic work to your house without council approval. You can also, like, if it's a business moving into a shop and it's a clothes shop or a restaurant, there is an ability to change the use without going through council. So I'll just let your listeners know that there is an ability to do that. But more often than not, you do need some type of approval. Like, obviously, if it's a new house, you need approval. So let's run with the, I guess, example of a house or a new house. So there are two main streams of getting an approval for a house. So they are a DA, a development application, which is through the local council. And then, as you described before, there's another system called a complying development, which is an approval through a private certifier. Now, the main difference between those two are with a complying development, it's just one set of controls for every council. So it's the same height, same floor space control. For every site is different, but it's generally one set of controls that you have to look at. Where it's under a policy called a SEP, or it's called the New South Wales Housing Code. A lot of people know it by that name. Whereas if you lodge a DA, you're going with, let's say it's a house in Ryde Council, so you have to look at the Ryde Council planning controls. There's an LEP and there's a DCP, a local environmental plan, and a development control plan, for those that don't know those terms. And whereas if you go to the next suburb, which might be, let's say, Parramatta, or whatever the next suburb to Ryde, it's a different controls that you have to look at. So that I guess is probably one of the many differences between the two systems.
Yeah.
The other, I guess, probably one of the most valuable or beneficial benefits of doing, let's say, complying development is it's much quicker. So once you've got all your paperwork or your plans ready to go for your new house, you send it to your certifier, and they have a couple of weeks. It takes them a couple of weeks to approve it. It's because you've prepared so well with all your consultants and your documentation, because 100% it complies.
Yeah.
Because if it's a centimetre above the regulations, it has to be a DA. So there's no grey area. Whereas in a DA, in a DA, there's a bit of grey area. There's a bit of room to move.
Mm.
Back to the timing. Whereas a DA, you could be sitting in there 6 months without a decision, even 12 months without a decision. Councils are very busy at the moment. In fact, I was talking to one particular council this morning where we've got a project, and he told me in the last few months they've lost a third of their town planners in council. So, and he said, we lodged it in November, and he said, I'm not going to be able to look at it for another 6 to 8 weeks. So that's going to bring it up to what, April or something, and we lodged it in November. So
that's a really important point for anyone that's considering. We've got delays in construction at the moment because there's material shortages. We've got, you're looking at delays in council for various reasons. Obviously, there's a whole lot of staffing shortages across a whole lot of industries. So anyone that's doing feasibilities at the moment and calculating the time frame and the cost of their project, you're going to probably have to increase it by 1.5% of what you would typically do in a normal situation. So what is then the benefit? So you've got compliant development, you've got strict criteria with that. That's the pros there. Obviously, that means that you can't even there's no leverage to be able to do anything creative. You've got to stick within that, and that's why. What is then the pros of the DA process over CDC?
Yeah, so with the DA, as I suggested before, there's a bit more flexibility. For example, somebody I know built a new house near where we live, and he's in a bushfire flame zone property. So his back garden, that's all bush. So that's one of the criteria which kind of threw him out of the complying development option. So his certifier told him, you're in a flame zone, so you can't do it as a CDC, you have to go with the council. So what he found was he was actually only allowed to get less floor space with a DA. So he could have got more floor space if he wasn't in a flame zone. Okay. So that's just one example of the opposite, the disadvantage of lodging a DA. But when you lodge a DA, as I said, there's an ability for council to be flexible. For example, you might be able to go over the floor space ratio because next door they had an approval for going over the floor space ratio or the height or whatever it is. So there's a lot. There is flexibility in a DA, but in saying that, it is quite difficult to be able to fully comply with council's controls. For example, it might be an irregular shaped site or a sloping site or a corner site. So there is a mechanism which allows council to be flexible, but that flexibility it's quite broad.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also with a DA, I should point out, there's no guarantee you'll get it approved, which is quite important to know. With a complying development, if it ticks all the boxes, then you're good to go. But with the DA, I've had projects where we've fully complied with everything, and council have said, well, no, you have to bring the top level in a bit more because of the streetscape and all these really subjective concerns. So, and I advise all my clients, while we can't guarantee you an approval, we can guarantee we'll do everything in our abilities to give you the best possible chance of an approval.
Yeah. And that's the other thing, like public notification.
Yeah.
You've got to do that in the DA process, but not in a compliant development.
Yeah, well, you do have to do it. So what you're asking is, so with a DA, usually once you lodge a DA, council sends letters to the neighbours for 2 weeks, usually to respond. And I think some people call it like the whinging period, because people whinge about, most often it's silly things.
That's a good name for it, the whinging period. Yeah.
Whereas with a complying development, the certifier has to send letters to the neighbours, It's basically a courtesy saying we've approved it, and here are the plan. Here it is. And in fact, I don't think the certifier sends out the plans to the neighbours.
So
So
it's more a notification rather than a process of approval.
yeah, they're not asking for comments. They're saying, just beware. You've got in the next few months or whatever, you're going to expect a new house that's going to be built next to you, but it does tick all the boxes. It does comply with all the regulations.
Yeah.
And also objections. I tell my clients, if you get objections, it's going to delay the process. And most DAs I get involved with, we do receive objections from the neighbours. But having worked in councils before, the council officers can kind of filter what's kind of a valid concern and what's just probably silly, like they're going to devalue my property or something. Whereas it might be a legitimate concern that, hey, if they build this new house, they're going to block my views of the opera house or the Harbour Bridge, which is certainly a valid concern.
And so at what point, because I and this is sort of an educational piece, obviously, for me, it's at what point, because we're having these delays in council, can you take your decision, your application to the Land and Environmental Court?
You can. You certainly can. I've been there many times in court, and usually we win. But it's not a nice process, I must admit. You don't want to get lawyers involved. Obviously, if your clients are mum and dad, sure, you don't want them going through that whole process. If it's a developer where they're trying to get 50 units on a block of land, that there's no real, it's just, the value of them to take it to court, it might be one extra unit or something that they can get. That's sure value to them to take it to court, and often it's a quicker process to take it to court. But what I suggest to people is before you decide, I guess in most cases, most of my clients, I tell them, but before you make the decision to take something to court, you've got to think about a few things. For example, obviously the cost and the stress and all of that, but also what are you willing to concede? So if it's a development with 50 units, you might have to concede on 45 units. Because these days, well, not these days, for the last, 10, 15 years, maybe more, the Land Environment Court focuses on mediation. So while it's called the Land Environment Court, most times you never ever sit in a courtroom. There's kind of two processes, two stages. The first stage is mediation. And if mediation breaks down, then certainly it goes to a full hearing in front of a commissioner in court, where you are, examined and all of that by solicitors and barristers sometimes if you have to. When I get involved in court cases, I have to act as an expert witness, which is it's a fun type of thing to do. But going to court is not for everybody. But if you're trying to push things along, or you want to get something which certainly it might have got refused already in council, and if you go back to council, it might get refused again. But if you go to court, I find councils, particularly council staff, are more inclined to negotiate with you and come to the table, rather than obviously it depends on the scale of the development, but there is a real push for an appeal in court to encourage mediation, and often that works.
And is there a specific milestone that you need to reach prior to applying to go to LEC?
Yeah, so there are a few different triggers, I guess. The first one is once you've lodged your DA, you've got 42 days after 42 days, you can lodge the appeal. However, there's kind of a loophole there where a lot of councils know this loophole, this 42-day time limit. If the council sends you a letter asking for more information within that 42-day period, then you can't take it to court, right? So that's one way councils try to prevent you taking it from court. And another way is if you end up with a refusal, that you've got 6 months to lodge your appeal. To lodge your appeal. And there are other different time frames too, but it is pretty time sensitive lodging an appeal with council. So there is, as I alluded to before, there is an ability. You don't have to go to court with a refusal. You can go to court while the DA is still waiting and might be in there for 6 months or 12 months or 2 years. You can take it, in most cases, almost any time you can take it to court. But I guess you've just got to watch out for these little triggers, like if council sends you, a letter for more information within the 42 days.
So the situation where council, you might have lodged an application, but you haven't heard back from council within 42 days, that's when, that's one of the triggers to say, I'm going to take that to court. More than that, 42 days, that's almost a month and a half. You'd like to think that at least someone would send you something.
You would hope so, yeah.
I know they're busy, but is that something sufficient for it to be an acknowledgement of the application, or do it needs to be further than that?
Yeah, they have to send a formal request for information. So they might say, we need an acoustic report, or you need to change your plans, or there's a non-compliance. Yeah, so there are certain things which they have to ask for, which kind of stops the clock.
So, Ellie, particularly in New South Wales, and you're dealing particularly in the Sydney metro area, are you noticing any particular type of trends as the type of developments people are doing, the type of whether it's DA, CDC that you're seeing that is coming up more so than previously?
I would say so, yeah. So now with CDCs, with a compliant development, you can actually get a dual occupancy approved for the last year or two. It is still quite a new system. You can even get townhouses through that also. In other words, you can bypass council. So that's becoming a trend, I think. But one of as far as DAs are concerned, I am seeing also dual occupancies very popular all around Sydney. Obviously, it's got to be permitted in your local council to do a dual occupancy, and the site has to be big enough and all of that. But that's what I'm seeing is becoming pretty common. There used to be a trend of boarding houses, as you're probably well aware of those, but slowly but surely the government has been changing the state policies for boarding houses to make it more restrictive. So I'm finding boarding houses are becoming a lot more challenging to get approved in councils, but certainly small to medium residential projects is fairly common at the moment in Sydney.
And is that, in terms of the dual occupancy and townhouse type applications, is that through the low rise, medium density? It's a long one.
It is a long one, but it all comes under the same policy, the SEP, exempt and complying, which started, I think, in 2008. But since then, the government has just tacked on all these different policies. So it is called the low rise code, or whatever it's called. And it's embedded in that.
And going back to your comment around the boarding houses, and I've got a personal interest in that because I'm developing co-living properties as well. Was it not the government's initial intention to provide more affordable housing and rentals?
Yeah, it was. And the policy also said you get a bonus FSR if you're doing boarding house. The policy also 0.5 for one FSR bonus. The policy also was very flexible with parking. You only needed, I think, 0.2 car spaces per room.
Was there a land tax exemption or something similar to that as well?
There could be. I'm not familiar with that. So there was, for example, 0.2 spaces per room, whereas an apartment building, you need to have one full space per apartment. But the government bumped it up to 0.5 car spaces. So I had when these changes first came out, well, usually, and people should be aware of this, usually when there's changes to planning legislation, there's something called a savings provision, where basically the government will introduce new policies. Let's say today there's the new policy, but yesterday I might have lodged my DA. So the controls that applied yesterday apply, and the controls today don't apply. So, whereas with some of the changes they made with boarding houses, there was no savings provision. So they had all of these boarding house projects. I had at least 2 projects that were affected by these changes. So one of our projects we had was a 10-story boarding house in Lidcombe, and we had, I think, 2 or 3 levels of basement. And so just changing it from 0.2 to 0.5 car spaces, we needed to double the amount of car spaces. So my client would have had to excavate another 2 or 3 levels, and they found it just to be too unfeasible, and we had to withdraw the DA. So there are that case, as well as when the government changes policies and they don't have this savings provision, which is kind of a legal loophole, that it's very uncommon. So it caught the industry by surprise.
Yes, and I know that during that time there was obviously a bit of an uproar from all the developers who had done these feasibilities, and within pretty much overnight, there were these changes in the.
It was quite sneaky.
Yes.
But I think, as you said, well, why would they do this when they're trying to encourage affordable housing? Well, and you now have something called a housing SIP, which further restricts. That was released mid-December. That's been on the cards for probably, I think, 1 or 2 years. So that further restricts boarding houses.
So for those who are looking at providing sort of affordable housing, and particularly affordable rentals within the planning environment, what are the options that you can see that are working well, that aren't necessarily, boarding houses per se?
Well, you can do granny flats. That's still considered, in a way, affordable housing.
Yeah.
You can even do a granny flat through a private certified. So and I have given presentations before COVID and seminars to mum and dad developers, face to face, who are just starting off in their development career, in their property development career, and often I see them buying a property and trying to whack on a granny flat out the back. You can do that through it. If you're lucky, you can do it through a private certifier and avoid council. So that's I think is quite if you're just starting off, that's quite a pretty good model to start with, as affordable housing is concerned.
And the minimum lot size for that is 450.
450, yeah. So if it's 449, it's got to go to council with a DA.
Yes, 450 plus, everyone. And boarding houses, if that's something that you really want to get into, make sure that you absolutely understand. We've got a few developers in the community that are doing boarding houses quite well, but I do know as well, many people are finding it difficult from a feasibility point of view with the planning requirements, but also the actual construction costs, making sure you get the construction costs within what works well for that sort of development also. So that's really interesting. I'd love for anyone that's joining us today, if you have any comments, any questions for Ellie, please feel free to ask. We've got a few people saying hello there. So Ellie, those of you who are in New South Wales and you are looking at sort of that residential space, I know that it's not only residential. What other types of developments, projects do you look after?
Like me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. It's the first time I'm using this StreamYard system. So apart from residential stuff, I get involved a lot with childcare centres. So new centres, a lot of the centres I'm involved with at the moment are in the new release areas, so the northwest and southwest growth centres, Sydney, because I'm finding the childcare operators are also finding it's a lot easier to get childcare centres approved out there, where there's no residents yet. They're still building the roads and the subdivisions, and the sewer and water hasn't even been connected to some of these places. So there's a bit of a tactic. Developer will buy the site, and we'll put the DA in for the childcare centre. And these are centres up to 120 kids. These are not small centres. Whereas a handful of childcare centres within the Sydney metro area, which are more challenging, because you've got neighbours, and the neighbours are not used to living next to a childcare. Now, I for one,
the sweet sound of screaming children.
I for one wouldn't want to live next to a childcare centre with 100 kids. I've got
You've
three
got
young
your own children.
myself. That's right. They're not that young anymore. My youngest is 8, but still, you don't want that next to. I wouldn't want to live next to a childcare centre. But so those type of childcare centres are challenging, right? And the other, I guess, my other forte is probably, I would say, dual occupancies and apartments.
Yeah.
And as well as, in the last 2 years since COVID, I've had a lot of clients come to me wanting to do like a home renovation. It might be a first floor addition, car space, whatever it is. So I guess those 3 key areas or key projects are kind of what we're involved with at the moment.
That's great. Ellie, we've got a question here. Would you advise to have a pre-DA meeting with council where development is subject to the DA process?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I could talk for hours about pre-DAs. I know we don't have hours, but it is a really it's a really good question, because I speak to architects. I speak to architects every day on the projects that we get involved with, and I've had conversations before with architects saying, why do we have a pre-DA? We know what council's going to say. We know the controls. It's a total waste of time. Now, sometimes they're right, but sometimes there's a bit of a strategy behind having a pre-DA. For example, one strategy I might use is the project, let's say, is there's you're going to be applying for, let's say, also a dual occupancy. You're going to go over the floor space ratio. You're going to apply, and council's going to knock it back, saying we don't like it. So then you lodge the DA, and you say, okay, we've listened to you. We've reduced the FSR. We still might not comply, but we've kind of listened to you. So there's a strategy in that in a pre-DA you apply for a little bit more than what you'd expect to get approved. And also I find too it's important to engage council up front, especially for more controversial developments, because that way you can kind of avoid a round of amendments to your plans after you lodge the DA. Whereas if your client is not going to listen to council, say, oh, not going to listen to them anyway, let's lodge the DA. So you might go with that, and more often than not, the council will raise the issues that, for example, I've told the client, and usually when I have a pre-DA meeting with council, I'll tell the clients 95% of what the issues are going to be, right? But there's always that 5% where council have said, well, actually, it's under the flight path, and you should submit an acoustic report, which is quite, which is not a big deal, or there's some other major thing that they've picked up that you might have missed. But yeah, I would encourage a pre-DA, and if you kind of umming and ahhing, should I, shouldn't I would say have the pre-DA. I know some councils are recommending it as kind of a quality control process for them.
Yeah.
And again, it really depends on the type of development and really your client's appetite to challenge council.
So I've personally quite enjoyed the pre-DA process, particularly just to be able to get a sense of where council is at and their like I said, their appetite for your development.
Yep, 100%. But in saying that, a pre-DA, one of the beauties with the pre-DA is you'll get minutes after the meeting, but the minutes might take the minutes the council sends you, but the minutes might take a few weeks for them to send it to you. But what I do is I like to write my own notes during the meeting, especially because sometimes they'll tell you some clues that they don't actually write. They might say, "Oh, why don't you design it this way?" And like, "Oh, that's a good idea, so we'll do that." But they won't necessarily mention it in their minutes.
Yes.
The other thing too is to point out, which some of your listeners will probably know, is a pre-DA doesn't hold council to anything. They can say one thing in the pre-DA, and say something else in the DA. I'll give you a quick example, if you don't mind. I had an email come through yesterday from a particular council in Sydney, where we lodged a DA for a new house on like a triangular shaped site in a new subdivided area, and the architect had 2 pre-DA meetings with council, like informal meetings that were booked in, and in both meetings, the council officers, there were 2 different officers, they said you should design it this way, okay. And we got a letter yesterday from council after lodging the DA saying we should design the house differently. So we're all scratching our heads like, but didn't they tell us we should design the other way? So in some respects, pre-DAs in this case might have been a waste of time. I don't know, but yeah, as I kind of alluded to, pre-DA with a pre-DA you can't hold council to anything really, because they might support the design in the pre-DA, and then when you lodge the DA, you might change a few things. They could refuse the DA,
Yeah, so in any case, it's sort of, it is, I mean, I've found it to be a helpful process, even if it's to pick up those sort of little tips and tricks and little nuances. But however, obviously not a fail-safe process on its own. We've got a few more questions here, and then we'll start to sort of pull it back a little bit. What kind of challenges do applications for childcare centres have over existing infrastructure? Hopefully I've understood that question correctly.
Presume infrastructure, probably they might mean schools, other schools and roads possibly. Well, maybe we'll run with that, infrastructure being roads and things like that. In the childcare centres that I get involved with, there's not one. You do need mind you, you do need a lot more consultants on your team for a childcare centre. One of them being a traffic consultant. I've never ever read a traffic report that says the childcare centre is going to create a disaster in the street. There's going to be no parking, and traffic is going to be a disaster. I've never ever read a traffic report that says that. Okay, so it's not saying that they're wrong or right, but in most, probably all the childcare centres I get involved with, traffic and on the street and parking is always resolved. we can always, and council agrees with us. You know, they might say all the issues, parking is fine, but the issue might be the design, or there's too many kids, or there's not enough garden or play area. So as far as existing infrastructure is concerned, I think that can often be overcome. Speaking of roads, you don't want to be putting in a DA right next to, the M4 or another major road like that. That's a no-no in terms of acoustics, impacts to the kids, and probably fumes and things like that. It's probably just the wrong spot for that childcare centre. I know also, like if there's mobile phone towers or power lines overhead, I guess naturally you want to try and avoid those sites. But those are not really considerations for council as far as the DA is concerned.
Yeah, and I think that's hopefully we've understood that question correctly. I mean, my what did pop up for me when you were talking about the childcare centres in these new areas was more so the business case around getting a DA for a childcare centre, but I'm assuming that these developers are holding on to that DA until there are enough people in the area to actually start construction. Is that sort of the strategy that they're taking?
Well, yeah. Well, they do also do their feasibilities. My clients find out where's the best location for a new centre. We had one centre which my client found, and literally across the road, I guess it was the state government, they put a DA in for a primary school. So they were going to have a few hundred kids across the road from their new centre.
Yeah.
But there is certainly a timing factor with centres in the growth centres, because they have to wait for the sewer and the water to connect and all of that stuff, and they might have to wait for the subdivision to be finalised and registering the lot where the childcare centre is going to be. So there is a sequence of events that have to happen.
Awesome. So moving on from childcares, and this is probably our last question. You mentioned resistant neighbours. However, in discussing development assessment panels, you clarified that objections might be based on existing controls and prohibitions. Let me reread that. You mentioned resistant neighbours. However, in discussing development assessment panels, you clarified that objections must be based on existing controls and prohibitions. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong here, whoever's popped that question. So say, for example, if there's a complaint around, it's blocking my view, that's not an existing control, for example. Hopefully that's what you mean. However, in the city, we make objections. So is that correct, that the objections for council to
Well, yeah, I think I'm understanding it correctly now. Like I said before, an objection, neighbours have the ability to say whatever they want about the development going up next door or in front of them. But things they can't, I recommend they don't say, are things like it's going to devalue my property, or it's going to destroy my outlook of my tree, or it's going to block my sunlight, even though with the orientation of where they're built, the building's going to be, it's not going to block their sunlight at all. So there's a lot of, as well as residents, can't read plans, which is fair enough. So they might have a general they might have no idea of what's being built. They don't understand it properly. So that's possibly why councils receive letters, objection letters, which are kind of, as I said before, it might be a bit silly. But if it's a legitimate concern, like the neighbour's window is going to be looking in my bedroom window or my balcony, or legitimate privacy concerns, which perhaps the developer has missed, and maybe it might be something that the council officers would have missed. It's definitely an important thing for the neighbours to flag this issue with council.
Yeah.
So I'm not suggesting nobody objects to any DAs. I would just suggest that if you're, and this is what I tell people too, is if you're going to lodge an objection, you have to try to get something out of it. I tell people there's two ways you can write an objection letter. One is it might be a 10-story building going up next to you, and you've got a 1-story house, and you just want council to refuse it. So that's one way the objection letter can be written. Or another way is might be a development that's kind of okay. That so it's not. It is still an objection letter, but you might write to council, I'm okay with it, subject to them, moving the building a little bit further away from me, or removing that window so it doesn't face my bedroom. So those, I guess, are the two types of objection letters that I recommend for people.
Yeah. So there's the blatant, I just don't want it, and then there's the other, providing some sort of a workable solution.
Yeah, and NIMBYism, not in my backyard, and it happens all the time.
Absolutely.
You can't avoid it.
No. We've had those. We've had ones where they've neighbours have complained about the big tree supposedly in our backyard being taken down. Turned out the tree wasn't in our backyard, and the tree wasn't being taken down. So
love it.
People sort of, like you said, when with kids you have the witching hour, and I guess we're planning there's the whinging hour as like well. The witching hour. Well, thank you, Ellie, for sharing your time and your knowledge. For anyone that's keen to have a chat to Ellie about any of your residential, potentially childcare type developments as well, reach out to him. We'll pop in his email, ellie@nevonplanning.com. Is it .au?
Yeah.
Perfect. And your website as well. Let me just check that. It's nevonplanning.com.au as well. You're really quite active on LinkedIn, so reach out to Ellie on LinkedIn. Also, that's one of the places we got connected, because he's constantly sharing a lot of value on there, and providing some topics to actually raise conversations around, particularly in the planning and development space. So thank you for your time. Again, everyone that joined us this evening, thank you for your contribution and your comments. Happy New Year again. I will see you all in the next series of the Business of Property. Next week, we'll have someone else in your Build Your Team series. So make sure you subscribe and visit our YouTube page. It's under my name, Cheryl Leong, and where you can find all our past Business of Property videos. And if you found value in our show, I appreciate if you click the like button and subscribe as well. So till next week, you take care, stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.